Hey everybody. So this lecture is an introduction to qualitative research. This is a supplemental to your reading in action research. I would recommend that you actually print off the PowerPoint that I've provided in Blackboard so you can take notes on it as I work through the slides. Some slides I'll be giving you some extra material, extra information that you may want to jot down. So first of all, here's a quote that really helps crystallize what qualitative research is. Qualitative research is empirical research where the data are not in the form of numbers. Okay, so that's important to remember. In the slide I did on the review of Chapter 1, I differentiated between qualitative and quantitative research. So the nature of qualitative research. The key to understanding this kind of research is the idea that meaning is socially constructed by individuals in interaction with the world. You'll remember that I did a sort of brief overview of epistemology in terms of how you think about how knowledge is acquired. Qualitative research is predicated on the idea that we construct knowledge in interaction with the world and with each other. In other words, knowledge is not just something out there to grab, it's something that we have to construct. And that's an underlying quality for qualitative research. There are multiple constructions and interpretations of reality that are in flux and that change over time. So, an interpretation of reality is continually changing. And it's not just one set standard for what constitutes reality. It changes over time, and it changes because of the people who are involved in it and the places in which they are involved. So we have to think about that in terms of, what that means for qualitative research. So for example, reality in a classroom of 2-year-olds is a different reality than in a teacher's lounge in high school, for example. So these different constructions of reality and how we interpret them change. Researchers are interested in understanding those interpretations of reality at a particular point in time and in a particular context. So if we go look at a classroom of 2-year-olds, what we want to learn is about that particular group at that particular time in that particular context. That group, we can look at that group again when they're 16 years old, but that's going to be a different reality. And that's going to be a different interpretation at a different point in time and a different context. So keep those 3 ideas in mind in terms of what the nature of qualitative research are. So I need to make sure that I explain limitations and strengths of qualitative research. Quantitative research is often cast sort of this sort of like, is qualitative research really empirical research? Is it really scientific? There's been a lot of conversation about that, but we have to understand that it's not the second best approach, as sometimes people will say. It's a different approach, not second best, okay? Qualitative research can be maintained in various technical ways. The researcher is created through the administration of a formal questionnaire, through the possibilities of replication and research, there are external checks on the methods used. It's a very sophisticated statistical and sampling techniques that are part of quantitative research. In contrast, qualitative research really emphasizes getting close to people, okay, and actually, as I said, up close and personal way of doing research. So techniques are unstructured, or and informal research may be used. It may be more structured interview techniques, but they're different. One is not better than the other. They're just different approaches. But there are limitations to both, and these are the limitations for. This is not exhaustive, but these are some limitations to qualitative research. Adequate validity and reliability is difficult because of the subjective nature. It's very hard to apply those strict scientific concepts to create validity and reliability for qualitative research. But there are methods to do this, okay? So inter-rater reliability is one. So the researcher, after having coded or analyzed his or her data, invites peers to look at that data too, a slice of that data, and you look to see that you are within 70 to 75% on the same page when it comes to interpreting that data. So that's a way of realizing some validity and reliability in qualitative research. Generalizations to a wider context is different, and this is true. I mean, if you're researching those 2-year-olds in a classroom, what the conclusions you draw from the research is applicable to that particular group, but very hard to generalize to other groups of 2-year-olds. I mean, in some ways it can be. For the most part, generalizations are difficult to do in qualitative research. Qualitative research can take more time. Data analysis collection takes more time, analysis takes more time, and interpretation. The presence of the researcher has a profound effect on the subjects. You cannot separate the self, the researcher, from the researched, because you are interacting with those subjects being researched. You can have an effect on that. So we'll talk about the reflexivity that has to come from that in a little bit, but it's a limitation. You can't be totally objective. Issues of confidentiality can present problems in some case. One thing that we have to work hard on is to mask the subjects with whom we research, so that there is confidentiality maintained. And we'll talk more about that as we go along. There are, however, a lot of strengths to qualitative research. Again, because the researcher is up close and personal, the researcher gains an insider's view of the field. It's not that distant and disconnected, survey that a statistician is analyzing in his or her office. You're out in the field. You're interacting with people or things. It's not just people. I tend to think of it as people, but with things, you may be analyzing documents, but you're getting that insider view. Qualitative descriptions can play important roles in suggesting possible relationships, causes, effects, and dynamic processes. So out of your research will come these rich descriptions that really can suggest some of these things that can change practices or change policy or influence practice and policy. And it adds flesh and blood to social analysis. I mean, let's face it, it's more personal. So we need to think about the theoretical approaches. Remember in my other PowerPoint, I talked about that. As you identify an area of focus in your research question, you have to think about the frame, the theoretical approach which you are going to take in understanding your data. It could be understanding I'm sorry, I'm looking at something else. I apologize. So over here in this side is the title, and over here is the agenda. And I'm going to go through each one of these in a little bit. So an interpretive approach would be to understand something. A critical approach would be emancipatory, or a social justice of empowerment, looking at political aspects, power and privilege. Participatory action research is action research designed by the participants and the researcher. And postmodern is sort of taking things apart, challenging binaries. All right, so let's look a little bit more in depth. Interpretive is understanding. So it's learning how individuals experience and interact with the social world and the meaning it has for them. I can go back to those 2-year-olds again. If you did an interpretive study of the 2-year-olds, you would be interested in how they interact and what that meaning has for them. But it would be within a specific research question, not generally. Here's a specific example. If you were interested in studying the placement of a child in a particular class, you might focus on understanding the experience from the perspective of the child, the teacher, and or the circumstances surrounding the placement. So, why was Johnny placed in a remedial reading class? Okay, and you would want to know what that child felt about it, or the teacher, or you might want to look at what the agenda was that got that child placed there, and then interpret and analyze that for an understanding of this situation. Critical is how the social and political aspects of a situation shape the reality, or how larger contextual factors affect the ways in which individuals construct reality. Okay, the example might be using that same placement of a child. From a critical perspective, you would be interested in how the social institution of the school is structured, such as the interest of some members and classes of society is served or perpetuated at the expense of others. Whose interests are being served? How do power, privilege, and oppression play out? So you'd want to look very carefully at, why Why was Johnny placed in this particular classroom? What are the politics behind that? Whose interests are being served? Are the more privileged students exempt from these kinds of placement? Who does the placing, and why does that person have that power to do so? Is Johnny being oppressed by being placed in this remedial class? So really looking closely at those critical aspects. Discourse analysis works really well with a critical focus. Okay, so discourse analysis is looking at documents with a critical eye. So for example, analyzing a school's handbook for teachers or a student handbook, looking at whose interests are being served. There's a lot of rich things to be seen in these particular documents. They seem very benign at first glance, but when we looks at it with this critical lens in terms of power, privilege, and oppression, a lot of interesting things can surface. So that's another way of using a critical lens, is looking at documents or text. That might be something you want to do. It also could be, again, looking at a situation of the example I've given here. Participatory action research is action research that we're going to conduct, but it involves the participants. So if you're going to do action research with a group of people, those people with you help design and implement the study. The objective is to empower the participants in the process of conducting the investigation. Okay. This is not a frame that I think is going to work well for our class because it takes a great deal of time. Doing a PAR in a 15-week semester would be very challenging. But you need to know what it is. Postmodern deconstruction. Okay, so this is a very interesting style. Modernism, modernism says that, there are these hierarchies or these aspects of reality that are set, and we know them and we can look at them and they are there. Okay. Postmodernism questions these aspects of the construction of reality, what it is and what it is not, how it's organized, and so on. So a postmodern study would question and disrupt the dichotomies inherent in the research problem. So similar to a critical stance, but this one is not looking so much at power and privilege as it is looking at, what are the assumptions here, okay? So for an example, in the child placement example, a postmodernist would question the relationships of child-teacher, child placement, okay? So our traditional ideas of what constitutes a child and a teacher, a postmodern would question that. Why are these dichotomies here, okay? Another example would be, this is happening in our schools, is the male-female dichotomy. There have been several schools who have been sued and challenged over girls and boys bathrooms, okay, in terms of that binary of male-female and not taking into consideration transgender. So again, it's the postmodernist stance is exploding those dichotomies and questioning them. A very interesting study might be of looking at a school's stance on gender, male to female, in terms of how those binaries are treated. I think of high schools and their king and queen of prom or winter carnival and so forth. What constitutes being eligible to be a queen or eligible to be a king. Very interesting stuff. If you're interested in gender studies, interested in a critical feminist stance or a postmodern deconstruction, that would be an interesting study to undertake. Okay, so those are, in review, let me back up here on my notes, theoretical approaches. Okay, so let's keep our terms. Theoretical approaches, the frames through the lens through which you examine your data. Then you use your frame then to create your research design. Okay. And this is going to depend on your theoretical stance. So you've kind of got to get your head wrapped around the lens through which you're going to look at this, and then look at the options for your research design. Your interest is in understanding a phenomena, a thing. Okay, you've got lots of options, and here's a list. We're going to look at these throughout this conversation. So, but I want to first look at key characteristics of qualitative research designs. Okay, we looked at the process in the other PowerPoint of the steps you need to do. But here are some of the characteristics. Okay, researchers strive to understand the meaning people have constructed about their world and experiences. This keeps coming up. You've seen it come up in other slides here as I talk about, the underpinnings of qualitative research, that knowledge is constructed. Okay, the researcher is the primary instrument. Okay, an instrument is the vehicle through which you gather data. In a quantitative study, the primary instrument might be a survey. Okay, but you are the person, you are collecting the data, so you're the primary instrument. The process is inductive rather than deductive. Okay, the product is richly descriptive. So a statistical report doesn't tend to be richly descriptive. It's very sort of cut and dried with statistical facts and with standard deviations and all those sort of things. But the product out of a qualitative research is narrative and descriptive. And again, I'm going to back up a minute. And that is through the examination of many different things or some things. Could be through the examination of artifacts and documents that I've already talked about. It could be through analysis of interviews, observations, experiences. Okay, so it's very, very broad. All right, so just a summary of this section of this conversation. Qualitative research attempts to understand and make sense of phenomena from the participant's perspective. Okay, in the case of discourse analysis, looking at a text, it's making sense of what that text viewpoint is, the viewpoint perspective of the text. But on another level, it's also looking at the writers or the constructors of that text. Okay, so there's always human involvement here as we look at phenomena. The researcher can approach the phenomena from an interpretive, critical, or postmodern stance. All qualitative research is characterized by the search for meaning and understanding. The researcher is the primary instrument of data collection analysis. It's an inductive, investigative. I cannot say that word. Investigative. I keep wanting to put the pronunciation on the wrong syllable, and it's really silly, but nonetheless, strategy, and a richly descriptive end product. Okay, we've talked about these, but here's a summary of sort of the things we need to know about this. All right, so here are the types of qualitative research. Okay, these are the types that we're going to look at. I'm going to look at each one in a little more detail. I'm going to limit your choices. Some of these are meant for much bigger studies than what we can undertake, but I want you to know about them. I mean, if you're going to understand what it is to be a researcher, you need to know the various kinds of research, but I'm going to narrow them for you. I think you'll thank me for that once we look at these. So there's basic interpretive qualitative study. The researcher's is interested in understanding how participants make meaning of a situation. This meaning is mediated, I forgot the D, sorry, through the researcher as instrument. The strategy is inductive and the outcome is descriptive. I mean, you've been hearing this all along, so this is the basic study. Data are collected through interviews, observations, or document analysis. These data are inductively analyzed to identify the recurring patterns or common themes that cut across the data. A rich descriptive account of the findings is presented and discussed using references to the literature that framed the study in the first place. This is the basic frame for research, and this is the one that we're going to use, okay? There's phenomenology. Phenomenology focuses on the essence of a structure or an experience. It's interested in showing how complex meanings are built out of simple units of direct experience. There's an attempt to deal with inner experience unprobed in daily life. This is a very, very interesting kind of research, but it's not one that we're going to undertake. It's much too unwieldy for us in this particular course, but it's there. You need to know about it. Grounded theory, we're not going to deal with this either, but I want you to know about it. So grounded theory is based on the fact that you can come up with a theory from the data. Okay, so by rigorously analyzing this data, a theory can be constructed. You hear that whistling? It's the wind through my window. I apologize. Um, and I've done this kind of research, and it's very interesting, but again, not something that we can undertake in a 15-week class. It emphasizes discovery with description and verification as secondary concerns. The researcher builds substantive theory that is localized and deals with particular real-world problems. A grounded theory consists of categories, properties, and hypotheses that state relationships among categories and properties. A little complicated, but basically it is gathering this data. It could be using that interpretive study, but then using a grounded theory approach to analyze the data to come up with a theory that's grounded in this data. A case study, we will use this or may use this. A case study can be layered over a basic interpretive study. So a case study is an intense description and analysis of a phenomena or social unit, such as an individual, a group, institution, or community. The unit of analysis, not the topic, characterizes a case study. Other types of study can be and sometimes are combined with case study, and we'll do that as well. So if you were, for instance, going to do a study of one person, maybe a student in a class or in the classroom, that is your case study. That person is the case, and it's bounded. In other words, there are no other people, groups within that. It's a bounded study. It's just this one person. Or if you were going to look at a classroom or a group of people, that's also a case study, and it's bounded by, because it is that group of students. It's not looking anyone outside of that particular group. If you're going to be looking at document analysis, that's more difficult to apply a case study to. Case studies generally are applied to when you're working with people. Okay. An ethnographic study refers to the beliefs, values, and attitudes that shape the behavior of a particular group of people. This is often used in anthropology. There are some beautiful and rich ethnographies out there that are very well known. Margaret Mead is one that comes to mind. It presents a sociocultural interpretation of the data. Again, this is a very interesting research method, but we're not going to use it. Again, this is something that will be a very long study, not something we can do. Narrative analysis. Narrative analysis is very interesting, and this is something that you may be able to do depending on what you choose. So narrative analysis is characterized by the use of stories as data. So first-person accounts of experience told in story form. Other terms for this include biography, autobiography, life history, oral history, autoethnography, and life narratives. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with biographies and autobiographies. And that constitutes and could constitute a narrative analysis. Several strategies to do the actual analysis of people's stories. So analyzing through a psychological lens, through a biographical lens, through discourse analysis. And so this may be something that interests you, and we certainly can talk about if you could use this. It doesn't mean that you tell the story, but it's not just a retelling of a person's story. It's the analysis of that person's story. Okay, so it's a good way. It's a good research approach, but it only applies to certain situations. Critical qualitative research. Okay, we've talked about this before. And now we're looking at, as a frame, as a theoretical frame, now we're looking at it as a design methodology. So it would uncover, examine, and critique the social, cultural, and psychological assumptions that structure and limit our ways of thinking and being in the world. Really looking at what is and what is not. The objective here is to free ourselves from these constraints and to be empowered to change our social context and ourselves. This frame informs feminist research and participatory action research. Okay, you may want to apply a critical lens, but not do a critical research style. Okay, they don't have to be together. You can use a critical frame in a basic interpretive study. You can use a critical frame in a narrative analysis. And we've talked about postmodernism as a frame, but you also can use it as a research style. So again, in contrast to the modern world, where reality is predictable, research is scientific, and they're assumed to be universal norms for truth and morality, the postmodern world is one of uncertainty, fragmentation, diversity, and plurality. There are many truths and or generalizations, hierarchies, typologies, and binary are challenged. So this is challenging those universal assumed assumptions for universal norms for truth and morality. It challenges the form and categories of traditional qualitative research. A postmodern design could be something that you do. I would sooner think that you would maybe apply a postmodern lens to a case study rather than trying to create a postmodern style study. Excuse me. So now what are we doing? So for purposes of this course, we're going to focus, I hope, on a basic interpretive qualitative study that could be a case study. As I noted, narrative analysis may work for some of you, depending on what you decide to do. And we can talk about what will work best for your particular interest. So again, if you're interested, we can talk about that. So action research is research conducted in one's classroom to inform one's teaching. An interpretive frame will work well for this. However, since most or many of you are not yet in a classroom, we're going to find other avenues for you to conduct your research. And I've talked about that, okay, for those possibilities. Whatever you do, though, will employ the basic tenets of action research and interpretive study. So we'll be learning to do action research, maybe not in our own classrooms, but we'll be learning how to do it and the value of it. And then so when you do become a teacher, you will have the context for doing that. Okay. When we meet face-to-face in a few weeks, we'll have a face-to-face virtually. We'll have a conversation about what you might want to do and how we might go about helping you to do that. I do want to leave you or give you some ideas about research in terms of being empowering. I mean, there are really 10 principles here. For one thing, it's meant to create improvement. Improvement in social justice. The results of the research includes knowledge and improvement. So one principle is that we want something to improve from our research. We don't just do it and put it on a shelf. We want something to happen from it. And that's one of the main tenets of action research, that we want to improve our practices. A main reason for doing research is to get knowledge and learn from it. Okay, so we're going to gain, not only improve things, we're going to gain a lot of knowledge and we're going to learn from it to learn how to improve. A radical change of some of our beliefs is possible. So we as researchers must be prepared to change our minds, sometimes radically, and to challenge others during and after and doing the research. So respectfully challenge. I don't mean, getting up and shouting like the Donald, I should say. But be willing to challenge others' viewpoints respectfully during and after the research. Researchers need to work collaboratively with people as part of the community carrying out the research. So you'll work collaboratively with one another and with me. You'll also work collaboratively with whatever constituency you decide to work in. You also must be open to the viewpoints of all those concerned. They may be very different from yours, but you have to be open to those. You have to be open to political groupings and perspectives. You need to seek out and be open to viewpoints of various socio-political groups. Politics are a big part of education, and we need to be able to look at all sides of that. And you must have some reflexivity, okay, in terms of your own position and your interest. And so you want to know what reflexivity is, I'm sure. And let me help you to think about that, okay? So reflexivity is the researcher's awareness of his or her effect on the process and outcomes of the research, okay? Remember we talked about that the researcher is the primary instrument. And because the researcher is the primary instrument, he or she is going to influence what happens, okay? This is based on the premise that knowledge cannot be separated from the knower. There's only interpretation through the researcher, okay? So you have to be aware of this, and so there has to be a recursive approach to examining this effect on the research. It's critical. So reflexivity means being able to look at one's effect. So reflexivity in number 7 is about your own socio-political positions and interests. There has to be a complete and constant examination of that, okay? Reflexivity about your own understanding and values, okay? Again, it has to be that constant looking at what you are understanding and the values. Perfection in research is not to be found. Utopia does not exist. No research study is perfect. It just isn't. You need to take responsibility as part of the wider education community, educational research community. You have to recognize your responsibilities as part of that. Again, we are a community of researchers. As a teacher, you'll be in a community of teachers and teacher researchers. So you need to be responsible for taking part in that. That's it, folks. That's a lot to chew on. And I kept it, I wanted to keep it 30 minutes, and I'm going over by about a minute here. Here are my references that I used. These are some great books. And the one by Hughes, you can actually go there and get that. It's a document, and I've used a lot of her ideas in here. I've borrowed generously from her. And I invite you to get that document if you feel that would help you in getting your head wrapped around some of these things. And that's it. So I'll be looking forward to working with you next week as we look at choosing a research topic. And I look forward to seeing you virtually face-to-face in a few weeks.